Good afternoon or evening, or whenever you decide to give me the time of day to talk like I might actually know something. I wanted to talk a little bit about my recent dive into Bob Hope movies that I did some months back, and, talk about some of the thoughts that some folks have put to me on Bob Hope. Or I wanted to address some thoughts that others have put to me on my thoughts on Bob Hope. Hopefully give people a bit of an understanding of where I come from in my philosophy on both movies and, Bob Hope. I don't have anything scripted. I'm just, winging it, speaking from the heart. So as movies have gotten progressively worse over the years, I've given myself a lot more time to go back and just take a look at older things that I used to like, or older things that I hadn't seen since I was a child. And I'd say, hey, I remember as a kid growing up with certain movies. Were those actually good or were they actually bad? And it's fun to revisit those kind of things. Much like revisiting the house you grew up in as a kid, it's also fun to revisit the films you grew up in, so to speak, as a kid. And I remember, Bob Hope was a big deal to me. Well, it was a big deal in my house, My older sisters would put on Bob Hope movies, and I thought nothing could be funnier than Bob Hope, or maybe also in combination with Danny Kaye, but we're not talking about Danny Kaye right now. So, as you get older, you leave a lot of those older movies behind you enjoyed as a child, and then you only want to watch new movies, and then at some point, you get reintroduced to your love of old cinema with a whole new appreciation that you never had before. And there's a thought out there that goes like this, and that is all older movies are, by definition, better than anything that comes out today, because older movies were more wholesome, and for whatever reason back then, everyone knew what they were doing. And if you criticize older cinema, it's because you're a Gen Z or millennial kid who is uncultured. But I think it's really unfair to have that sweeping view of older movies, because there are tons of bad old films, and there's also a ton of really good old films. There are great older movies that really stand out, and they don't need to be given the handicap that it's an old movie, so even bad things, or things that you would perceive as being bad about them, you can't criticize it because it's just how they did it back then. So if a film appears boring, it's not the film, it's you. But having watched a whole lot of older movies, I've discovered, no, that's just not true. There are older movies that are so well made, and they don't, and it's unfair to just group them in with other older films and say it's uncriticizable because it's old and avant-garde. I'm probably not explaining this too well, but hopefully you guys kind of see what I'm getting at. Like I recently watched, not recently, but like half a year ago, I watched El Cid. I honestly thought El Cid was not very good. And I compared it in my mind alongside Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments, because Charlton Heston starred in all three movies. And I said, Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments are far superior films to El Cid. And it's unfair to say El Cid is as good as Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur, because it's not. So periodically I enjoy going back and finding some older movie, something that I've not heard of, or something I've not seen since I was a kid, and going back to reevaluate and say, was this actually a good movie? And sometimes it's not. Sometimes you watch something that you saw as a kid and you're like, oh my gosh, this is really bad. Other times you're surprised that, that's somehow well certain older films hold up. So I went into Bob Hope movies. So I watched about 6 Bob Hope movies in the last few months, as of when I'm making this recording. And I wanted to know, was Bob Hope actually funny? Were his movies actually good? Because maybe they're not. And if they're not going to be good, then I want to criticize the bad and separate that from the good. And as I watched these older Bob Hope films, I posted a bunch of my thoughts on Facebook about some of them, and I got a little bit of blowback from some folks saying that I was being a little too harsh, or at least that was the impression I got. So I want to explain, in greater detail my approach to this, my approach to Bob Hope. One, I think Bob Hope what I've discovered is that he has made some great movies. And in fairness, Bob Hope starred in all these movies. I don't actually know who directed his films. Obviously, they were, tentpole projects around Bob Hope, if that's the right term. These were movies made for Bob Hope to star in. Also, I decided to separate Bob Hope from Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, because I know there's the road movies that star Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, and I seem to remember those were pretty good, but I wanted to just separate that because Bob Hope has Bing Crosby helping him out a lot in those movies. They both have each other to play off of, so I just wanted to isolate Bob Hope on his own. So what I discovered after watching about 6 Bob Hope movies is only one of the 6 was actually good. I watched My Favorite Blonde in 1942. I didn't actually finish it. The Princess and the Pirate, which is one I remember from being a kid, and Princess and the Pirate was really bad. Yeah, 1944, that was Princess and the Pirate. Monsieur Beaucaire, one I had never seen before, 1946. That was really bad. It had just enough charm to get me through it, and it did have some funny Bob Hope moments that I will remember. But it was bad. It was a really bad movie. It was very desperate. The actors were constantly flubbing their lines, and props were constantly getting knocked over, and obviously they wanted to get it all done in just a couple takes. Then I watched My Favorite Brunette, 1947. That's one that I remember being hysterical when I was younger, but upon revisiting, the first 10 minutes were really funny, and the last 10 minutes were really funny. After that, it was just kind of, the whole middle section involves Bob Hope going to an insane asylum, like, inmates doing stupid, crazy things. Sounds like a lot of old comedy from back then. Then I also watched The Lemon Drop Kid, which, somebody assured me that it was one of the better ones. It was better than the 4 I just mentioned, but even Lemon Drop Kid was just kind of okay. Put it on around, it's a Christmas film, so watch it around Christmas time, I'd say. And then finally I watched Casanova's Big Night from 1954. And I remember it being really funny as a kid, and as an adult, it was still funny. Hands down, Casanova's Big Night is my favorite Bob Hope movie. It's the best Bob Hope movie I've seen thus far. And I would like to find more Bob Hopes to add to the list of good Bob Hope movies. Now, I think whenever I get harsh on Bob Hope, and I criticize a lot of his movies and say, oh my gosh, these films, they just don't hold up, people see me as like taking enjoyment out of the world or something. How dare you go after Bob Hope like that? These are untouchable films from a better time, when comedy was cleaner and movies were more wholesome. So you just can't criticize these older movies. I once saw a little bit of a debate happening among a few YouTubers about subjectivity and objectivity in art, and somebody was saying when you criticize movies enough that people start to dislike them, what you've done is you've taken enjoyment out of the world, and that's a bad thing. And someone else responded by saying, I forget what he exactly said, but essentially this other person said he didn't mind ruining movies for himself, because once there could be something that he likes, but once he realized that it's bad, it makes the good so much better. So, once you realize there's something you used to like, it's like, oh gosh, it's bad. Then you go back to watching the good stuff and you say, oh yeah, this is why I love this movie so much, because it's just so good. Plus, as I've been reiterating, it's unfair to the good stuff that certain film. It's unfair to all the good movies out there that you lump bad movies in with them. So coming back to Bob Hope, from the 6 movies I mentioned, I only really enjoyed one of them. They all had some enjoyment. So if anybody wanted to say, oh come on, I just love old Bob Hope nostalgia for the mere sake of it, then I totally read you. But Casanova's Big Night really is a good movie, and I don't want it lumped in with My Favorite Brunette, Monsieur Beaucaire, or The Princess and the Pirate. I would rather preserve the best Bob Hope films. I would rather, if somebody said, I've never seen Bob Hope movies, can you, refer me to a few of them to check out? I would want to give that person a top 5 Bob Hope films to look at, because I want to preserve the very best of Bob Hope. Otherwise, you have to go through a slog of horrible movies and say, well, was anything this guy did ever good? And that's not fair to Bob Hope. That's not fair to his best work. So, let's separate the bad and preserve the good. I have that view on a lot of things, where people will say, oh, you need to read G.K. Chesterton, you need to read some Charles Dickens, you need to read some Jane Austen. And as time goes on, it's getting harder and harder to preserve all these great authors. And my feeling is there has to be a top 5 list for every great filmmaker, author, artist, where it's like, okay, these people have put out so many things, you gotta whittle it down, okay? Otherwise, it'll all be forgotten. So give me the top 5 Bob Hope films. Top 5, maybe 10 if need be, if you can find a top 10. And then you have only good Bob Hope movies to go back and revisit. So far, as of this recording, I only have one Bob Hope film that I think is truly great, and that is Casanova's Big Night. I would like to add more to that list. If anybody has other ones that they think are actually great or pretty good, please tell me. And like I said, I'm not including the road movies in this list because I think those are pretty. I've not seen the road movies since I was a kid, but I'm guessing those hold up much better than most Bob Hope movies. Alright, that's all, I think. Take care, everyone.